Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Sorry I can't be at class today, but I'm going to go ahead and get you some notes through this video that hopefully you're watching on Edmodo right now. And then I'll have a quiz on Edmodo that goes with this video. And that's pretty much going to be your lesson plan for today. So please take notes during the video. Write down any questions that you have, and you can ask me those when I get back tomorrow. And then you're welcome to use those notes on that quiz at the end of the video too. So we're going to talk circulatory system, which is blood, which you guys have been playing kind of like online simulation games with for a few days, so you're a little bit familiar with this at any rate, but we're going to talk in a little greater detail about that today. So we're going to start with blood, and then later in this chapter we're going to move on to the heart, which is a lot of fun. So you have a lot of blood in you, 4 to 6 liters, give or take, and blood has very important functions. Number one, transportation. No duh. Blood carries nutrients, nutrition from what you eat. It also carries hormones. It carries oxygen to cells, and then it picks up waste from cells. It also picks up carbon dioxide from cells, urea, and it's going to take those to all sorts of really important places like your liver, like your kidney, like your lungs, and we can filter things out, exhale CO2, and just keep the good stuff in. And so blood transports really everything you need. Also protection. It carries phagocytic white blood cells. Phagocyte means to eat a cell, and these cells eat other cells, and a bunch of specialized proteins called antibodies, which mark foreign invaders so that we can quickly find them and destroy them before they make us sick or kill us. And so blood is, of course, incredibly important. And third, it helps us regulate all sorts of things for homeostasis, our acid-base balance. Our blood helps us regulate that. It helps us regulate our temperature, which we've already talked about in this class a little bit, vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Vasodilation to become larger lets out a lot of heat. Vasoconstriction does not let out a lot of heat. You might have seen this if you're out in the cold too long. Your fingers can kind of get a bluish tinge because they're vasoconstricting those peripheral veins and arteries, which is kind of cool. So, blood. It's red in color. No duh, you knew that. And that red is due to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is very high in iron, and the iron exposed to oxygen, not unlike the process of rusting, turns a red color. And so hemoglobin is the reason your blood is red. Now there's a couple different types of blood. There's arterial blood. Arterial blood is leaving the heart, and it has a lot of oxygen in it. High oxygen levels turns that hemoglobin a crimson red. Now there's also venous blood. This is coming back to your heart after it's made the whole trip around your body. And there's a lot less oxygen in that blood. And so because there's less oxygen, it doesn't have that nice bright red color. It has kind of a dark red color. And when you view that through the skin, it appears to be kind of blue. And so it kind of led to this old wives' tale that your blood's actually blue, but when you bleed and it's exposed to oxygen, then it turns red. No, that's not true. Your blood's red in your veins. It's red. I know you can look at your arm right now and it looks blue, but that's just because certain wavelengths are making it through your epithelium and certain wavelengths aren't. But we could get a little needle in there with no oxygen, and that blood would be just as red can be. So there's your blood. Okay, so 8% of your body weight in a male, blood's going to make up 5 to 6 liters. In a female, it's going to be 4 to 5 liters. So it's a pretty safe bet. Can we just say 5? You know, unless you're a really short girl or a really tall guy, probably about 5 liters of blood. So that's how much blood you have. It's about 5 times more viscous than water, which is like 5 times more thick or gummy than water is. And the pH of blood is 7.4, and it has got to be nose on at 7.4. It can't really vary much from that. If it varies any more than about 0.2, it's going to make people very, very sick and cause some serious health effects. So blood pH is very closely monitored by a bicarbonate system, which is really cool. So there's different types, parts of your blood, and the first is called blood plasma. And blood plasma is just the liquid portion of the blood. No red blood cells, no white blood cells, just the watery stuff blood cells and formed elements are transported in. And it's going to be clear or kind of a clear yellow color, and it's 92% water. And then the 8% that's not water is solutes like gases, hormones, elements, those kinds of things. But mostly it's really just water. If you want to donate blood plasma, if that's like your thing and you want to donate here in Rapid, you can donate this stuff all the time, like every 2 weeks if you want. It's crazy because it's mostly just water. You drink a whole bunch of water, blood plasma is replaced. So there are some plasma proteins, and these are the most abundant solutes in the blood plasma, and there's 50 different types of proteins. We don't learn every single protein because that would be crazy, but there are 3 main groups, so I will teach you just those 3 main groups, and this is floating around in that water. There's albumins, globulins, and fibrinogens, and they're just proteins, but they're very, very important proteins. And so here is what blood kind of looks like if you spin it down to its parts. Here's red blood cells, make up 45% of the sample. White blood cells and platelets combined are going to make less than 1% of the sample. And then plasma, or basically glorified water, is going to make up 55% of the sample. And so that's kind of how your breakdown is. So this picture is really not that accurate because there should be about 50 red blood cells and 1 white blood cell, but they want to show you a couple white blood cells. So here's the blood vessel, artery, vein, something like that. You got the blood vessel, and out comes the fluid, and that fluid is composed of plasma, these sticky little platelets, which are going to be working very hard to close that wound. That's these guys with all the fibers coming out of them. The red blood cells, which are that biconcave disc, or the donut that doesn't have the hole punched all the way through. And then the white blood cells, which have the multi-lobed nucleus, or sometimes can be mostly nucleus, and we'll talk about those later too. So I told you I'd tell you about albumins and fibrinogens and stuff like that. I tried to get you a picture of a protein, but proteins aren't that terribly exciting. So the first is albumins. Albumins, 55% of the plasma proteins are albumins, and their job is to thicken the blood. Having blood be thicker than water is important when you want to maintain osmotic pressure of blood and you want to maintain blood pressure. That's what albumins do. Number 2 is globulins. Globulins make up 38% of the plasma proteins, and you guys don't have to memorize like what percentage makes up what proteins in the plasma. Like, that's not that big of a deal, but I do want you to know the 3 types and what they do. So the globulins, these guys make all sorts of different products, but one of them there's alpha, beta, and gamma, and the one that gets the most attention for us is the gamma. And gamma globulins are the guys who make antibodies in our immune response. And making antibodies and serving rather as antibodies is really a very, very important job, because they're going to float around just looking for bad guys. When they find a bad guy, they stick to him, and that's it. That's all they do. They don't kill him, they don't do anything, they just stick to him. And that tells other white blood cells something's up, and they can find the bad guy a little bit easier. And then there's fibrinogen, and fibrinogen makes up a very small percentage, but that is a precursor to fibrin, and that protein is going to play a big role in blood clotting. So, formed elements in the blood. When we talk about formed elements, we're talking, this is no longer plasma. This is an element that is formed like a red blood cell, white blood cell, or a platelet. And we talk first about hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis is the process of producing new blood cells. Before birth, your blood cells are produced in the yolk sac, which you're kind of digesting as you're growing. They're also produced in the liver, and they're produced in the spleen. And then once you're born, it's going to be in the red bone marrow, where we're really going to be making a lot of blood cells. And those are going to come up from stem cells that can give us different blood cells. And so we're going to talk about a couple of things. What's a spleen do? Because we said that it comes from the spleen. And 2, how does this transition happen from the yolk sac, liver, spleen to red bone marrow? It's kind of a huge transition. And so it's kind of an interesting thing. So a spleen in anatomy is an organ we haven't really talked about yet. So here you go. This is a spleen. Here's the esophagus. This is where food comes down. Here's the stomach, holds the food. Here's this big old liver, which you guys know is like our filter. Here's the gallbladder, which drains into the small intestine. And then here's the small intestine, and then tucked behind the stomach right here is this little guy called a spleen. And we're like, what the heck you doing back there, buddy? Where's your answer? He breaks down worn out red blood cells, and he recycles iron using the macrophages. Your red blood cells don't live that long, maybe like 120 days, and your body is great at recycling. And the spleen is the place where a lot of that recycling takes place, and a lot of it's finished up in the liver, but it started in the spleen. So that's one job the spleen does. Second job, which is really cool, is the spleen stores blood, up to like a cup of blood, which is kind of amazing, by dilating the vessels in the spleen. And that's a really cool thing. So if viruses and bacteria are detected while blood passes through the spleen and the lymph nodes produce lymphocytes, and the lymphocytes produce antibodies. And so the spleen also plays a role in us detecting if we're getting an infection. The spleen can tell that and work with our lymph system to get some antibodies in here, start sensing that infection, learning it, being better at killing it a little bit quicker. And so very cool organ. Storing extra blood is kind of an amazing thing. You know, if you get for that second function up here, storing blood, like there's a reason it can even contract and kind of push that blood out. If you get a really bad injury and you're losing a ton of blood, that's a bad thing, because as you start to lose blood, your blood pressure is going to go down. You're going to feel faint. You could pass out, and you can't take care of your wound. That's a bad thing. And the spleen, when your blood pressure starts to get low, that spleen can actually contract and push that blood out to give you that extra boost in blood pressure to kind of help you through a tough spot if you're suffering from a serious injury. So spleen does a lot. Sometimes you hear people who get their spleen removed. That happens. That happens sometimes. And you can live without it. Your liver, your lymph nodes, they're going to try to compensate for that, sensing the infection, making the antibodies, storing the blood, that kind of stuff. Are they going to do as great of a job as if they had a spleen? No. But can you live without it? Yeah, you can get by without a spleen. So this graph is a super cool graph, and it is the transition of who's making the red blood cells and the formed elements of blood from growth in a human through time. So we have fetal months, 0 months to 9 months to birth, birth to age in years, 10, 20, 30, 40, 70 years old. And it's just such a cool graph. So we have our prenatal time before birth and our postnatal time after birth. And then our percent cellularity is basically what percent of the cells are built where. And so when this baby's tiny, 2 months old, the yolk sac, that's where it's coming from. The yolk sac is used up pretty quick in about a month. 3 months, the yolk sac's basically gone. And as the yolk sac tapers down, the liver and the spleen take off. And the liver and the spleen are both working hard till about 5-month-old baby, still in mom. Liver and spleen start to tank right as the red bone marrow starts to take off. And then the bone marrow peaks at about birth. And then at birth, the liver and the spleen have both pretty well tapered off. Now the lymph nodes are going to come up a little bit, do a little bit of work, and that's going to be pretty much consistent throughout life. And then that bone marrow here, it just splits it off into different bones. You guys don't have to know that really, but vertebrae and pelvis make a lot. Sternum, ribs, femur. That's kind of what the bone marrows all break out into. But it's just a really cool transition. Because I had a student ask me that, when does the yolk sac stop and the bones begin? I was like, well, I don't know. It's a tough question. And now that I have this graph, you guys can know the answer to that question too. And the answer is, it's a pretty smooth process. One tapers off as others begin. Yolk, liver, spleen give way to bone marrow. It's a very cool system. So, red blood cells are erythrocytes. Erythrocytes are red blood cell. They're the most abundant formed element. They're 95% of the formed elements of red blood cells. And their job primarily is just to transport oxygen and to transport carbon dioxide. Oxygen goes from the lungs to the cells of the body. Carbon dioxide goes from the cells of the body to the lungs so we can exhale it. If you have a low number of red blood cells due to a disease or an injury, that's called anemia. And red blood cells are small and flexible, and that's good because they have to get through capillaries, which are incredibly small, sometimes so small that really only about one cell can pass through at a time, and they're disc-shaped. Mature red blood cells do not have a nucleus. They just don't need much information. You know, they're really just surface area for oxygen and CO2. They don't need a lot of information in them to do that job. The biconcave shape, so concave is like an indentation in, and they have that on both sides, so bi is 2, biconcave shape allows for a higher surface area for dissolving gases than if they were to be something like a circle. That would not be such a good design, but their shape is incredibly efficient. So, red blood cells transport oxygen from the lungs, like I already told you, and carbon dioxide to the lungs, and hemoglobin is the pigment that binds to oxygen molecules. And once it's bound to oxygen, we can go ahead and call it oxyhemoglobin. So, hemoglobin contains iron, and iron is what actually attracts the oxygen and turns red blood cells red, which we already talked about that a little bit too. Oh, pardon me, had to yawn. Getting a little tired. I have that new baby around. Red blood cells live only about 120 days, and then they're going to die and be recycled, and new ones are made continually from the bone marrow. So here's a little diagram that shows you how red blood cells are doing their job. The red blood cell is pretty deprived of oxygen as it moves into the lungs. In the lungs, oxygen moves into the red blood cell, and we have oxyhemoglobin now. We carry that throughout the body, all the way to tissues, muscles, or whatever, and the oxygen is then released in those tissues in the body, and carbon dioxide is picked up. We go back to the lungs, we drop the carbon dioxide off, and the oxygen comes in, and we repeat the cycle. So, white blood cells. There are lots of different types of white blood cells, but white blood cells, red blood cells were erythrocytes, and white blood cells are leukocytes. Leuko means white, and cyte means cell. And these guys primarily function as macrophages. And macrophage is something that eats big particles or eats other cells. And that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to phagocytize damaged and aging cells. And if those cells are ours, that's fine. They'll eat our own cells. And if those cells are some foreign invader like a virus or bacteria, that's fine. They will eat those too. So hemoglobin's broken down into green pigments called biliverdin, and it's further reduced to an orange pigment called bilirubin when we start to recycle our red blood cells. And biliverdin and bilirubin go to the liver, and they're excreted as bile, but we actually keep all of that iron and we recycle that in the bone marrow for new red blood cells. And so white blood cells are important not just for trying to find a bacterium or virus, but they're even important for just the job of recycling our own red blood cells, finding those old worn out cells and getting them where they need to be so they can break down. White blood cells are pretty few in number. They're not nearly as abundant as red blood cells. They contain a nucleus, and they can wander outside of the circulatory system and go fight infections in skin and that kind of stuff. So there's two types. There's granulocytes and agranulocytes. And basically that's just looking at their cytoplasm. If it looks grainy, they're a granulocyte. If it doesn't, they're a granulocyte without granules. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. So we'll start with our granulocytes. There's three types. There's neutrophils, there's eosinophils, and there's basophils. So they kind of count the number of lobes in the nucleus, but that gets kind of confusing because like the neutrophil has 2 to 5 lobes and the eosinophil has 2 lobes. And so if it had 2, it could be a neutrophil or an eosinophil. So don't memorize those lobe numbers necessarily, but I do want you to know kind of what they do. A neutrophil, its job is to travel to the site of infection, turn into pus, and die. And it's going to leave that wound eventually, and it's going to contain a bunch of virus and bacteria that it's eaten and digested and has protected you from. So it's sort of a sacrificial sort of job. Eosinophils, they're specialized just to pretty much look for parasites and kill just parasites. And then there's basophils, which have an S-shaped nucleus, and their job is to release histamine. And there's lots of different histamines, but there are lots of different chemicals that can cause a histamine reaction. But basically, histamines not a very fun thing because you're familiar with this if you've ever taken an antihistamine in the spring or the summer. When basophils release histamines, they cause the infection site to swell, and that's vasodilation. And if you release histamines in the springtime and the summertime, when your body's having an allergic reaction to something in your environment, then you're going to have, you know, swelling in the nose, swelling in the eyes, and the eyes get itchy and the nose starts running, and it's not very fun. So we sometimes take antihistamines to suppress this. But know that there's a purpose for these histamines, is they're bonding with immunoglobulin proteins and prostaglandins, and they're causing an infection site to swell up. And so a swollen infection site is actually kind of a good thing because it keeps you from moving it, and it allows lots of red blood cells and white blood cells to get to it to heal it. But when we get those histamines and allergies, your body thinks every little thing it's breathing in is a foreign invader, and it's just kind of going crazy. So your eyes are always puffy and your nose is always runny, and you're kind of overreacting a little bit to what would be a really good process. You're just kind of overdoing it to, pollen or whatever you're seasonally allergic to. And so there's your granulocytes and kind of what they look like. The little nucleus there, the 2-lobe nucleus there, and then the 3 to 5 lobe nucleus here. Now next we're going to look at agranulocytes, which are lymphocytes and monocytes. So agranulocytes have no granules or very few granules in the cytoplasm, and the monocytes are the largest cells in the blood. Their nucleus is massive. It takes up most of the space in the blood, and their job is basically to be a macrophage. So it's important to have a really big nucleus when you're really smart. And a macrophage has to be really smart because he has to identify and eat things that don't belong in the body, but leave things that do belong in the body. Then there's lymphocytes, which are about the size of a red blood cell. They're quite a bit smaller. And they're going to have a really large round nucleus inside that lymphocyte. And there's a few different types of lymphocytes. They're in the lymph system, of course, but the lymph system and getting into the blood can be pretty easy. There's B cells, T cells, natural killer cells. And these guys are all directly related to fighting infections. B cells make antibodies. Antibodies stick to the bad guy. T cells are going to kill the bad guy the antibody sticks to. And natural killer cells, as their name would imply, are also going to kill cells that antibodies stick to. And so lymphocytes are really about identifying cells that are not you and trying to get rid of them. Cool. So why do we have all these white blood cells? Well, to protect us from disease. That's why you kill the cells that aren't you, right? There are some really cool features they have, like diapedesis. And diapedesis is the ability to squeeze between endothelial cells in a blood vessel and actually leave that blood vessel and move to a different area of the body to fight infection. And when white blood cells interact with foreign microorganisms or damaged cells, they're going to default to just bring it in and eat it. And a lot of times that's going to kill the white blood cell, but that's okay because the bad guy's contained, and that's what white blood cells are all about. If they move to an infection site, they eat the bad guy, they die, the white blood cell stays there. That can eventually become pus in a wound that's maybe not as clean as it should be. And that's a collection of living dead and broken cells and plasma that can come out of a wound. Okay, so finally antibodies. These are proteins produced by the lymphatic system, and they're going to act against foreign particles in cells by hooking to them and identifying them as foreign. And it's basically how your body remembers a disease. The whole reason we do vaccines is to give you a chance to build up antibodies to a disease that you don't need to actually catch to be able to very effectively fight. And I have a YouTube video about antibodies, but it does require a little bit of discussion because it talks about these really cool variable loops. So we're going to leave it there for now. You can pause the video at any time when you're taking notes, and you can go rewind to places because I know I was talking super fast to kind of make sure those notes are in really good shape. But there is a quiz on Edmodo I'm going to have you do, and so take the notes that you have from this, go back and rewatch parts where I was talking too fast, and go ahead and take your quiz. Thank you for your time, and I hope everything went okay with accessing the video and accessing the quiz. Thanks for your time.